منى أباظة تدير الجلسة الأولى.
Hello everybody. Can you hear me properly? Okay. So I was asked to, before I introduce my speakers, to start with a few points as a moderator, throwing out a few ideas concerning the gentrification of the future of downtown, and then I will be presenting our speakers. So evidently, for the next 2 days, one of the main concerns of this conference will be the question of gentrification of downtown, and what I'm saying, I'll be repeating a few ideas that have been already mentioned by Lisa Anderson and Omar. And with the appearance on the scene of the Ismailia company, which has been purchasing numerous buildings, restoring and upgrading these, well before the January Revolution, this has raised many concerns about the future of downtown. And so we have the phenomenon of Ismailia company purchasing old buildings, restoring them. And this has been going on parallel to fostering public arts and culture. After January 2011, the center of downtown witnessed the flowering of cafes, bookshops, internet spaces for youth. It is not that these spaces did not exist before, but that the cultural sphere in itself became a central theme in the relationship to public spaces after the Tahrir effect, which Lucie will be talking about today. So today the question of gentrification of public spaces cannot be dissociated from the question of the restoration of order under the military, through the military, the clearing up of street vendors, and the renovation of the center itself, the cleaning up. It should, however, be reminded that the revamping and beautification of downtown in 2008, 9, and 10 were one of the main targets of the Mubarak regime, which traded with the discourse of enlightenment. So the then enlightened state intellectuals believed in the good intentions of the state in preserving the nation's heritage, such as Samir Gharib's National Organization for Urban Harmony, Lajnat al-Tansiq al-Hadari, founded in 2004 under the umbrella of the Ministry of Culture. So if one recalls then, these debates had already instigated a myriad of controversies on whose downtown we were talking about and which conflicting imaginaries it was triggering. And this raises the question of how to trace continuity and where is change. And this is me as a sociologist, my concern. Are we not caught up in, once again, repertoires? And I think the question, I'm really working on the issue of repertoires since 2011, repertoires in art, repertoires in graffiti, repertoires in the establishment, in politics, a question of old wine in new bottles. The bourgeois bohemians of downtown, a term borrowed by Sharon Tsukin, who describes the gentrification of New York, could well apply to the Cairene downtown scene, and which Lucie will be also mentioning here, and which has been already circulating widely among researchers well before January. We can here recall, for instance, the Nitaq festival before the CAF. Now we're speaking of the CAF and Shirkat al-Ismailia, but before the Nitaq, the long shortcut exhibition, the Greek club, the numerous bustling galleries that were already existing for at least some 2 or 3 decades. Thus, once again, where is continuity and where is change in the community of the gatekeepers and producers of culture? And that is a question that I'm raising, and I hope to find an answer among the crowds here and among the journalists of Manda Masr who have been really producing very fascinating articles. And still, this is an open question. So can one really speak of a revolutionary transformation in the field of curators and gallerists after January in relation to public spaces? Third point, how to link possibly the possibly current gentrification with the phenomenon of the nomadism of the rich. I'm quoting here Galil Al-Adi's book on downtown, Le Centre-Ville. And she really describes the old bourgeoisie as nomadic. The so-called ancienne Egyptian bourgeoisie, and today the Cairene rich, never really cared about defending their own gentrified spaces historically since the 19th century, but kept on continuously deserting the previously decaying Belle Epoque residents like Abdin, Asr al-Nil, Ahmed Helmeya, to move onwards to entirely new areas like Zamalek, Mohandesin, Heliopolis, Do'i. And today this nomadism continues to the desert satellite cities in Dubai-style replicas, gated communities and compounds. And I think this is very important. If we are speaking of downtown, we have to keep in mind the dream of the new rich is not downtown, and therefore we have to think about what is this conference all about? And personally, I see no real interest in people residing in downtown, apart from some exotic friends, Khalil Al-Adi, Maria Golia, Huda Lutfi, dreamers, okay, dreamers, and some expatriate community would like to experience the taste of nostalgia, and we all are caught in this nostalgia of the Belle Epoque colonial times, and we are all caught up and reproducing the same discourse which Lucie, again, is going to tell us something about today. So would the appropriation of downtown by capitalists transform Cairo into a soulless CBD center for yuppies and professionals while remaining eternally in denial to the sprawling slums عشوائيات? Of course, slums عشوائيات is not translated as slums, but one last point, the euphoric Bakhtinian carnivalesque and dramaturgical moment of January, which caught the attention of numerous observers and which lasted for almost 4 years, it has withered away, is gone. So how are we to cope now with the further militarization of urban life, of walling urban life? And here the work of Stephen Graham is crucial to understand the new military urbanism, to understand what all the cities of the South and the North are inspired by models by military as urban planners, right? And has culture, or rather revolutionary culture, become the means per se to pacify the city and actually erase the memory of urban wars? The memory of urban wars, I think, is the most important point that we need to think about today. How about the usage of non-political spaces, and here I'm quoting Gerald Caden, who will be speaking tomorrow, in the process of pacification and constant efforts at the erasure of political memory? And here, also the question of revamping non-political spaces such as passages, the fostering of restaurants, cafes, as a countering or pacifying image of the zoned militarized section. And tomorrow I'll be talking about the narrative of two cities. We are living two cities, two areas, very different areas. And this remains then an open question. Thus, and I'd like to end my tone and then introduce my speakers, we might end up reflecting upon what Sharon Tsukin has termed the growing capitalist control of the symbolic economy of the city when she speaks of New York. A trend which started in the 70s in the US, investing in the arts as forums for gentrifying public spaces as a way of manipulating violence. And here it's interesting because it becomes the memory of violence that has become a standard means by which the culture industry, and it's important, I think culture industry is for me is a crucial word today. Adorno is still alive and kicking and to understand what's going on. That is becoming a question: how are we dependent on financial capitalism in a moment of restoration of order under the military? So these are the points I stop here, and I'd like to introduce now my speakers. Ernesto Lopez Morales is an associate professor at the University of Chile and PhD in urban planning from the DPU University College of London, and he is a principal researcher in the Contested Cities in International Network and the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies, where he focuses on gentrification. So he's really the person to tell us about the process we're experiencing. And he's written a lot about neoliberal urbanism and published widely. Lucie Ryzova is lecturer in Middle Eastern History, Department of History, University of Birmingham. And Lucie is a social and cultural historian of modern Egypt with a particular interest in Egyptian popular culture and vernacular modernity. And she has published widely on the Afandiyya culture and on the revolution, Mohammed Mahmoud, events and consumer culture and youth. Engineer Akram Ismail Mohammed is the director, مدير عام المباني التاريخية الشركة المصرية القابضة للأصول العقارية. So I stop here and I give the floor to Professor Ernesto Lopez Morales. Okay.
I am first.
Is Lucie first?
But I can, as you like.
No, it's,
Who's first?
Sorry, it's Lucie. Lucie's first. So
Oh, really?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's
Okay.
fine. Well, good morning. Where is the thing that is going to push it? Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. Is it working? Oh. Okay, Tamim, can you hear me now? Gosh, it doesn't sound like my voice at all now. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me, Omar, Beth, Cluster, and AUC. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a historian, and I was asked to provide a brief historical overview of the social history in downtown the past few decades. Let me just, how does this work? Okay. So, downtown Cairo means many things to many people. To most middle-class Egyptians, it is a dirty and dangerous place, associated with chaos. Yes, they rarely go there, as they simultaneously extol its past glory. Lamenting the decline and ruin of downtown has become a widespread cliché in Egyptian public culture. This articulates with the perceptions of the failure of Egypt's post-independence history, or even the failure of modernity. In this context, zahma, or crowdedness, means not just physical traffic, but rather a form of human pollution of sorts. Downtown remains popular with low-income publics. Lower middle-class families come here to buy their Sunday best, or to just stroll and stare at gaudy shop windows. Young, low-income males come here to attend a movie in downtown's many affordable movie theaters, or to just hang out, gawk, and loiter. This, however, is hardly all there is to Cairo's downtown. Its patina of former glory attracts its own publics. It is well known today as the hinterland of Egypt's 25th January Revolution, the site of a vibrant cultural scene, on which we will hear much more during this conference, and a favored meeting place of artists, intellectuals, and activists. This, however, is not a new phenomenon. Downtown's history as the center of Cairene bohemia and political dissent is many decades old. Many of its street cafes, ahawi, bars, and restaurants represent de facto cultural institutions patronized by generations of Cairene literati, artists, and activists. Art spaces proliferate, as do cultural festivals big and small, though importantly, their publics may not always overlap. There is not one cultural scene in downtown, just as its cafes and bars don't represent a single culture of dissent, but many such cultures. Hence the title of my paper, Like Ships in the Night. When it comes to downtown Cairo, the whole is considerably larger than the sum of its parts. More recently, downtown has been the focus of more tangible claims backed by state legislation and private capital. Gentrification plans are underway, led notably by the Al Ismailia company, whose model of urban regeneration aims to encourage and exploit the artistic vibe of downtown. In a parallel move, Egyptian government agencies have been contemplating the cultural rehabilitation of core parts of downtown, although so far these efforts remain largely cosmetic. This newfound interest in downtown Cairo, perceptible not just in its valorization through law or capital, but also in the wave of public nostalgia, stems from a wider process of neoliberal reframing of Egypt's modern history. This nostalgia represents a radical departure from earlier post-independence models of national historical imagery, in which downtown, the site and embodiment of colonial power and privilege, had no place. The growing interest in the area on the part of government, capital, and sections of the educated Egyptian public writ large should be understood within the broader context of neoliberalism, as well as in relation to the simultaneous urban flight by Egypt's middle and upper middle classes to newly built desert cities and gated communities. In this spatial logic, Cairo downtown emerges as the symbolic monument, an open-air museum, to Egypt's colonial past, newly recast as a golden age of tolerance, liberalism, and prosperity. So clearly, downtown Cairo is a place with many competing meanings, a site of multiple claims, social, cultural, political, and economic. These already contested meanings gained new resonance with the January 25th revolution and the long-running revolutionary process. While the epicenter may have been Tahrir Square, the whole surrounding area, especially the southern edge of downtown around Babelu Square and the streets leading to the Ministry of Interior, was a crucial site of protests and of epic urban battles with police. This struggle continues, although the forces of revolutionary change now appear to be on the defensive. This past winter, several episodes of cleansing downtown of undesirable elements served to demonstrate the new regime's attempt to impose its own order. They targeted two groups that, from the normative perspective, are most associated with polluting Cairo's urban center: street vendors and revolutionary activists. The cleanup campaign involved closing down cafes that over the past few years had become known as the turf of activists and revolutionary youth, though they really served a much larger clientele of youth from all over Cairo coming to hang out here. All these acts of cleaning were aimed at eradicating the non-hegemonic and socially porous space of downtown, its essential liminal and heterotopic quality, which is the theme of my paper. Heterotopia comes from a brief 1986 essay by Michel Foucault, in which he observed and defined urban heterotopia as a space that functions in non-hegemonic ways, and in between space, a space of otherness, simultaneously physical and mental. Such heterotopic space has many competing layers of meaning and can only be understood in relation to other spaces outside of itself, to normative spaces and normative social roles as they exist elsewhere. Both liminality and heterotopia share certain characteristics: social porousness, flexible boundaries of class and gender, celebratory or carnivalesque qualities. These characteristics appear to some as danger and pollution, or matter out of place, especially when seen from the outside, while to others they conjure the feelings of greater freedom and liberation from normative social roles. I argue that Cairo downtown is a liminal or heterotopic space par excellence. It is a heterogeneous space, a space where everyone is a stranger de passage. This social porousness invites non-hegemonic forms of behavior and is in turn constructed by them. It is also a symbolic location that is crucial, first by its absence and then by its presence, or indeed its growing centrality, to Egyptian national imagery, and as the site of competing claims on social order that extend well beyond downtown's spatial boundaries. So I will attempt here to very briefly chart the history of downtown Cairo as a heterotopic space. Crucial to this history is the eclipse of downtown as the site of power and privilege throughout the second half of the 20th century, and the simultaneous rise of its bohemian anti-hegemonic character. I'm also interested in how is this heterotopia produced and reproduced on the ground. Leaving investment and legislation aside, many others will speak about this, I want to focus instead on the diverse publics that use this space and how their spatial practices, their ways of claiming or practicing the city, construct downtown Cairo as heterotopic. These groups include subsequent generations of Cairo's artistic bohemians from the 70s throughout the 2000s, revolutionary youth hanging out in and around Babelu and Hoda Sha'arawi, and young, macho, low-income males who come to downtown to gawk and loiter. So very briefly, since its foundation by Khedive Ismail, it was really in the interwar years that downtown Cairo became the heart of the colonial metropolis. This is where elites, both national and foreign, lived, and where modern businesses, services, and institutions were located. It was an area of upscale shopping and leisure. But while in many ways downtown was always exclusive, it was also always heterogeneous, meaning socially mixed, and predicated on drawing in publics from all over the city, even if only temporarily. Middle-income Egyptians flocked here to partake in the many pleasures it had to offer. Downtown's Grand Magasin catered equally to solvent outsiders, and middle-income families, otherwise labeled as traditional, came here for their seasonal shopping. Cabarets and cinemas along Imad ad-Din Street, the city's prime entertainment district, catered to diverse audiences, including provincial Effendi youth visiting the brothels on its fringes, and of course many middling youth, Effendi students from near or far, who came here simply to wander, window shop, and check out the next movie on lobby cards. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, downtown was gradually abandoned as the site of upper middle class residence, business, and shopping and leisure, and started to assume the shabby appearance it has today. Conventionally, in the public discourse of the late Mubarak era, this decline was attributed to Nasser's expulsion of foreign minorities from Egypt following the 1956 Suez War and his nationalization policies of the 60s. This interpretation is historically wrong. Foreign minorities had been gradually leaving Egypt for diverse reasons long before Nasser assumed power. The politically motivated narrative presenting Nasser as responsible for the decline of downtown significantly leaves out the takeover of this area by Egyptian elites between the 1930s and 50s. As Egypt's foreign population was diminishing, middle and upper middle class Egyptians, especially prosperous professionals who had always been part of downtown, even though first as a minority, had been gradually taking over this upscale urban space during the middle decades of the 20th century. This Egyptianization of downtown was demographic or real as much as it was symbolic or cultural. By the late 1940s, downtown's grand boulevards had been fully appropriated and recast in Egyptian popular culture as the site of high Egyptian modernism. Here, architectural wonders such as the Immobilia building, among many others, symbolized late colonial nationalism and post-colonial pride and optimism alike. Immobilia was home to Egypt's foremost cinema stars and de facto headquarters of the entertainment industry. It was routinely deployed as background in movies and advertising of the 40s and 50s to conjure up images of urban glamour and national modernity. This Egyptianization of downtown did not last long. Throughout the 1970s, prosperous middle and upper middle class Egyptians started favoring new pericentral areas such as Mohandesin, Agouza, and a bit later Madinat Nasser, in addition to the older but expanding Do'i, Maadi, Heliopolis, and so on. These patterns of urban reshaping were closely connected to the rise in car ownership and the overall development of Greater Cairo during and after the Sadat years. In a nutshell, the decline of downtown ought to be located less in the Nasser era, but more so in the Infitah years, when the widening of social divisions and concomitant selective prosperity started a process of urban segregation, which continues to this day. Although increasingly deserted as a place of upscale residence, downtown throughout the 1970s and 80s remained a favorite center of shopping and entertainment. It remained a place for special visits for prosperous Egyptians who now lived in other upscale areas. And of course, it became even more awesome as a place for outings for those coming from less privileged neighborhoods. Such special outings included shopping for special occasions, but importantly, it meant attending movies. Certain films could only be properly enjoyed in downtown. Say the release of a new James Bond movie, which necessitated its own rituals of young male autonomy, tazwir, teenage boys from Do'i or Heliopolis collectively skipping class to attend the next James Bond in downtown. The same selective prosperity that accelerated the rise of new upscale urban centers had yet another effect on the rapidly depreciating center of the city. Downtown became the showcase of new and increasingly exclusive consumer culture. Downtown's shop windows of the Infitah era featured glitzy, fashionable clothing that few could afford, while Shawarbi Street became nationally famous for its black market of brand clothing. This black market of the 70s marks a crucial turn in the history of downtown heterotopia. Downtown thus both generated new desires, including illicit, non-hegemonic desires, and provided its own ways of satisfying them. The movie Hatbet al-Haram is an excellent example of the lure of downtown for a young, downwardly mobile man in the mid-80s. He comes here to escape boredom and a no future situation in order to stroll, hang out, and check out women's bodies. Despite the glitzy shop windows featuring infitahi lifestyles that are the true reason of his misery, downtown is not in fact alienating. Instead, it offers him a refuge to dream and fantasize about women, the kind of contingent autonomy that I will discuss in a bit. When he finally falls in love, it is in one of downtown's cafes that he meets his sweetheart and finds privacy in the midst of anonymity. Now, interestingly, 1986 was also the year when Michel Foucault wrote his Heterotopia essay, and I wonder whether Michel Foucault may have been hanging around Cairo in the mid-80s. So with the decline of downtown as the residential and commercial heart of Cairo during the last third of the 20th century, it gradually acquired a particular bohemian quality as the prime site of independent culture often linked to political resistance. A number of downtown cafes, bars, and restaurants emerged as famous hangouts of generations of Cairene literati, artists, and political activists. While practically none of them lived there, most writers and intellectuals worked nearby because most cultural institutions, theaters, publishing houses, and so on, were located either in or near downtown. This downtown bohemia became quasi-institutionalized through the ways in which certain people habitually frequented particular places at regular times. Downtown bohemia had its own rituals like the Tuesday night tradition. Here, generations of literati, generation of the 70s, 80s, and 90s emerged. Coteries of artists would form, dissolve, and realign throughout their shared forms of sociability. Social capital was to be gained, careers and futures were made and unmade through the ways in which people congregated and socialized in one place or another, in the presence or absence of others. This downtown literary bohemia constructed itself in opposition to official, hegemonic cultural institutions. It was defined against the older generation of artists and literati and against official spaces of culture. And it was projected into concrete urban locations, specific downtown hangouts. This implicit opposition gave rise to the expression in the 1980s of the triangle of horror, Musallas al-Rob, denoting the area between Atelier, Grillon Bar, and the Bustan Café. This expression, Musallas al-Rob, signified the danger of scrutiny or even rejection to which intellectuals who were too openly allied with the regime were likely to expose themselves if they breached the borders of this non-hegemonic space of alternative oppositional cultural production. Something important happened in the 70s. Downtown's mainstream glamour was gone, overtaken by the thrill of the illicit, the black market, the bars, the possibility of sexual encounters, or the anti-establishment, the bohemian world, both being non-hegemonic, of course. From the 1970s on, hanging out in downtown no longer simply bestowed one with status in the eyes of normative society, but rather made a person socially suspect. Just as this illicit or suspect quality became actively sought after by some as a component of social capital in particular subcultures. Around the year 2000, a new transnational art scene, what happened? Sorry. A new transnational art scene emerged in downtown, starting with, as you all know, around Townhouse Gallery. I'm trying to shorten my paper, but importantly, Townhouse was an anti-establishment phenomenon of sorts. It broke the monopoly of state-owned art spaces and structures of power and patronage, orienting itself instead towards global tastes, publics, and art circles. It partly liberated young Egyptian artists from dependency on the state, while also introducing its own hierarchies of exclusion. The hype surrounding the Townhouse Gallery was responsible for bringing a new kind of crowd into downtown, younger, more elite, globalized crowd, raised in other upscale areas of Cairo. In hindsight, Townhouse venture makes perfect sense in its urban location and ought to be understood within the pre-existing framework or history of downtown's heterotopic infrastructure. its many bars, cafes, and restaurants, its patina of decay and former glory, its trademark feel of a free zone derived from its characteristic social porousness. This new downtown cultural scene works in very much the same way as the earlier Bohemia of the 60s and 70s and 90s. Few of the protagonists and their publics, or indeed few of the investors who have stakes in the gentrification process, are willing to actually live here. Downtown is a site of cultural pilgrimage. People come here to hang out and then they leave. To some, hanging out in particular bars and cafes marks their belonging to an urban subculture to which downtown's aura of decay, an aura that already has a neoliberal twist to it, is key. Others come here to enjoy the relative freedom and autonomy afforded by its characteristic social porousness. To others from very different social spectrum, downtown has retained its association with upscale festivity, and they come here to hang out, stroll, loiter, and gaze at shop windows. It has always been a heterogeneous place predicated on drawing in audiences from all around the city. This non-hegemonic space also encourages a heightened performance of social roles. It works as a theater stage. Social porousness does not mean the absence of rules. Rather, it is a space of improvisation which has rules, scripts, or codes of its own. This cultural geography of downtown, in which different generations of artists, literati, and activists hang out in different places, often only meters apart, reflects a salient conflict over the ownership of culture or of political resistance. Particular cafes may be associated with one coterie or another, but this will only be known to the initiated. Indeed, different coteries of the initiated may also stay invisible to one another. It is therefore not surprising that the younger publics who come here to occasionally hang out in downtown are largely ignorant of the long legacy of downtown's Bohemia, its protagonists, and its antics. But this is precisely how downtown's heterotopia works. Diverse publics come here to enjoy the radical autonomy that this space offers, while passing each other like ships in the night. 3 minutes, I'll be done. This is all possible because downtown has no homogeneous inhabitants of its own. It does not really have a Hali. And of course, it depends how we define downtown, but I'm going to leave this for later. Taken as a whole, the actual inhabitants include a number of very separate groups. Dwindling old-timers, usually older people, locally resident foreigners, most of whom live here for a few years and then they leave, a handful of Egyptian intellectuals or artists who usually have homes somewhere else, and the fringes of downtown, such as Bab el-Lou or Ma'ruf, are more densely populated with downwardly mobile middle-class families whose failure to move out marks their social decline. And to these should be added a substantial, mostly male population of workers and small business owners who do not technically live here, but account for most of its social density. These 5 categories of downtown dwellers do not interact. Passing each other like ships in the night, they do not form a local community. It is the fractured character of its inhabitants that accentuates downtown's character of, again, heterogeneous assemblage of strangers, de passage. Its trademark feel as a place belonging to no one but available to everyone, which may be interpreted as chaos and human pollution by some, but also harbors possibilities for radical autonomy, though temporary autonomy, for others. So I'm moving to my conclusion now. I have to mention very briefly that at least 2 other publics equally claim the city center as their own: revolutionary youth and young, low-income males who come here to stroll and loiter. I am skipping over this part. Just let me mention very briefly that the strolling patterns in downtown ought to be understood within the context of patriarchy, whereby young men can only achieve full autonomy when they are far away from the control of their senior males, and so this has to be understood also spatially. So young men achieve full autonomy, understood in gender terms as full masculinity, through particular social and spatial practices, notably strolling and loitering in downtown. And I don't have the time to elaborate on the revolutionary, and this is entirely my fault, by the way, on the revolutionary, yes, I have to stop, last paragraph. Downtown's many heterotopias, its diverse publics, all of which partake in its utopian, non-hegemonic quality, and whose ways of practicing the city in turn constructs this space as non-hegemonic, came together in unique historical moments, notably the revolution, and specifically its urban battles with police in and around Mohammed Mahmoud Street. The result was akin to chemical fusions, virtual explosions of radical autonomy, moments when normative social roles, social and political roles were reversed, and one could virtually breathe radical autonomy in the air. While the free land of Hoda Sha'arawi may have diminished over the past year, pockets of revolutionary autonomy remain. If only because downtown's non-hegemonic quality is emphatically not simply the product of the revolution, and therefore more resilient than any of its enemies are able to imagine. During the revolution years, downtown has emerged once again as a triangle of horror, a free land where persons or ideas connected to the ruling regime, most importantly the SCAF or Ikhwan, were on enemy land. Indeed, they rarely dared to come here. If they did, they were ridiculed and evicted. Downtown's heterotopic infrastructure is likely to ensure the continuation of this culture, just as the historical legacies discussed above are likely to ensure that the struggle over the control of downtown, its symbolic or real ownership, will remain ongoing for the foreseeable future.